Are we good? I don't have a mic, right? Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you all, and thanks to those of you who are joining the live stream. We appreciate you coming. My name is Michael Sherwin, and I am a professor of photography and coordinator for the photography area here in the School of Art and Design. I have the great honor of introducing our visiting artist tonight, Zora J. Murff. Before we begin, I just want to make a couple of quick announcements. Number one, please silence your phones. Thank you very much. Number two, for those students who are in the audience or on the live stream, don't forget the deadline for the School of Art and Design's juried student exhibition is coming up 2 weeks from Friday on October 14th. There are a lot of monetary awards available. Should I repeat that? Including one specifically for a photographer. Thanks, Gary Schubert, if you're out there. So please do apply. It's worth your time. Lastly, I should mention there will be an opening reception for Zora's fantastic exhibition at No Point in Between, which is upstairs in the main lobby of this building immediately following the presentation. So please pardon me while I read through some amazing credentials of our visiting artist tonight. Zora J. Murff is an assistant professor of art at the University of Arkansas and co-area head in the photography area in the School of Art. Murff has exhibited at venues including the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, Illinois, the Studio Museum 127 Project Space in Harlem, and the Gregory Alakar Museum in Fort Collins, Colorado. His work has been published in Aperture Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, and the Atlantic. Murff was a recipient of a Mid-America Arts Alliance Artist 360 grant and a 2019 Lightwork Artist Residency, and a finalist for the 2019 Aperture Foundation Portfolio Prize. Murff has published 3 monographs, including At No Point in Between, which was selected as the winner of the independently published category in the Lucci Foundation Photo Book Awards. In 2020, Murff was announced as the winner of the inaugural Next Step Prize awarded by Aperture and Baxter Street at the Camera Club of New York. His work was presented at the 2021 Rencontre d'Arles in France as part of the Louis Roederer Discovery Award. I hope I said that right. And next month, on Thursday, October 13th, Zora will be participating in a forum on contemporary photography titled Are New Pictures Possible? With the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. We are so pleased and honored to have Zora visit us on his fast track to stardom. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. For those of you in TV land, thank you for tuning in. So I'm going to go through my lecture, Looking as a Radical Act, with all of you this evening, and there'll be some time for questions at the end. So I like to start this lecture with this quote by Michelle Alexander. She says, "It's not enough to learn the broad outlines of this history. Only by pausing long enough to study the cycles of oppression and resistance does it become clear that simply being a good person or not wishing black people any harm is not sufficient." And this is something that she wrote for the New York Times in an op-ed June 8th of 2020. Something that I consider myself when I think about that Alexander quote is the idea of attention. She's calling us to action solely through paying attention. And I feel like this is something that I've explored, throughout my career as an artist, and something that I plan to continue to do with my art. My colleague Aaron Turner, who I work with at the University of Arkansas, he's an abstractionist, and I really admire his inventiveness of pointing at critical issues of race, but understanding how abstraction is a keen way of getting people to implicate themselves in looking at a work of art. And so this work that I'm presenting here, 31 degrees, 7 minutes, 25.94 seconds north, 81 degrees, 33 minutes, and 22.45 seconds west, is an artwork that I made shortly after Ahmaud Arbery's murder in Satilla Shores, Georgia. He's a young black man who was pursued and killed by multiple white men, modern day lynching. And I was out in a park with my partner Raina, and I happened to have my camera on me, and I was thinking about being outside and sort of what that meant, that particular day to me, as Ahmaud was weighing heavy on my mind. And I made this image as a way to reflect on him, and maybe I made it for him. And I ask myself how we reflect on these moments and the realities that we find ourselves in today, how I can bring that into a work of art, sort of in this abstract way, asking you to pay attention. The title of the work, are these coordinates that are the location where he was killed. And so even though I wasn't there, even though this photograph isn't a representation of that place, through a title and through making a blurred image, thinking about him running, I can bring those things together. And I hope that, you bring that level of attention here tonight as we talk about, what I'm about to present, and hopefully carry it forward. And I'll also use this as a moment to acknowledge that there are descriptions and images of violence in this lecture. So I didn't set out to be an artist, a photographer. I, thought I was going to be an English teacher, maybe a chef. I did the thing that we do, aimlessly jump into college because everyone's telling you, it's the right thing to do. And I took some psychology classes, and those were the classes that I felt I was doing the best in, where I was actually paying attention. I was thinking critically about the information that was being handed to me. And I ended up, pursuing that as a degree and working in social services after I graduated. And in 2012, I moved to a new town, Iowa City, Iowa. And I started working as what's called a juvenile tracker inside of the juvenile criminal justice system. So it's a form of incarceration where kids aren't actually incarcerated. It's like a community release type of program. And then I'm just, traveling around checking up on these kids. And it was at that same time I decided that I wanted to go back to school for art. I had, bought a camera, started making pictures, discovered that it was something that just spoke to me, and, wanted to educate myself in it, to become as good as I could be at it. And so, I started merging the professional work that I was doing with the art that I started making, and that's the series Corrections. And I like to think of this portrait, Kenny at 19, as my birth as an artist. That really special place where insight, intention, expression, and maybe even a little bit of luck come together. And this young man was in the early days of his probation. And so, it was this really complicated situation because I'm this person providing this service to him, but then I'm also working as an artist and a photographer to try to tell some sort of story about the system. But I remember this moment really vividly, where I was, I showed up and, wanted to make his portrait, and I was just looking for a place that had nice light, and I found this spot, and he was just sort of standing there waiting for me, right? And I didn't know what to do, and so I'm kind of fumbling with my camera, trying to come up with an idea. And like sort of the trouble of making the portraits in this work specifically was that I had to keep the kid's identity shielded in some way. And a lot of the earlier portraits I had made, I was exploring, trying to do some sort of like digital intervention, but that felt like I was erasing people. And so I started to try to find ways of, like them using their bodies or things in the environment to exclude identity. And so I'm standing there and I'm fumbling with my camera, and he just reached up to scratch the back of his neck. And I saw it, and I was like, wait, that's it. Hold that, please. And I made this portrait. And, it was like I knew it was good. It was like the first time, as an artist that I had recognized, like in the moment, like, man, this is good, and I'm the one doing this, right? And so this, in a way, sort of became like a standard for like the work that I was doing. And so, like doing this work, I think, was an interesting way of becoming a photographer because of, I think, the ethical implications that there is an inherent power dynamic between me in this role as a tracker over these kids. Also considering, the stigma of criminality. Once you're deemed a criminal, that stigma like rarely ever goes away and has, legitimate impacts on people's lives. And in the act of photography itself, that I'm the one with the camera, I'm the one controlling the image. And that always brought me this level of discomfort, especially when I started showing this in critiques in classes. Because you have these people who have different levels of privileges that have allowed them to not be in the predicament of these kids that they're looking at. And like, what ultimately does that mean? And so, this work was really important in those formative years of developing, I guess, maybe acknowledging intention when it comes to making an image, acknowledging that forthrightly, even when other people around me didn't want to have those conversations. And I think just remembering that, like, art brings this level of, like making something into art brings this level of reverence to something. But at the end of the day, these are people, these are real people in real circumstances. And so, yeah, I feel like over the years, because of that, I've always been really sensitive about the art that I make and the stories that I'm trying to tell. So the series like sort of unfolded in this really serial fashion where I, really dived into the portraiture of it. But, a lot of the feedback that I was receiving, like people were asking, like, can it be more than portraits? Like, how else can you add to talking about this experience? And so I started incorporating landscape images. I started going through these archives of documents that we had in our office, from the kids who are incarcerated who have to do these assignments, and really trying to, like, I guess, look at these to suss out how they were feeling about their predicament. And, when I started doing this, I started at the same time asking myself questions about the expansiveness of what a photograph could be, what a photographer could be, what a camera could be. And I feel like thinking in that way about art also helped me open my eyes to the realities of the criminal justice system this oppressive system, this system that is rooted in chattel slavery. And so I started educating myself, and thankfully, in Eastern Iowa, they're really great about doing publicly accessible research and reports on criminal justice trends. And I started reading that literature, looking at the numbers, trying to suss out what these numbers mean. And then it dawned on me that, I'm reading, these numbers that I'm seeing, these are the actual kids that I'm working with. Within that, I'm seeing these patterns along race and socioeconomics. So a majority of the kids that I'm working with, they're poor, they're black or brown. They lived in a particular neighborhood in Cedar Rapids where I was working. And that helped me understand how the nature of white supremacy has come to pervade institutions. Michael Brown was killed by Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson on August 9th, 2014. This isn't my artwork. This is a piece by artist Anna Martine Whitehead titled Ferguson Morning. And just off camera, if you're familiar with this image, Michael Brown's body is laying out on full display on Canfield Drive. And the police would leave him there for 4 hours for his community and his family to witness before somebody decided to cross the barrier and cover his body with a sheet. Shortly after this image made the news, I was called into a meeting with some of my supervisors and colleagues to talk about the dire circumstances of this moment and what that meant for the kids that we worked with, because our role was to be an intervention between them and having contact with the police. And they wanted to help us figure out how to talk about this directly with the kids. One of the supervisors in the meeting made a hands up, don't shoot joke. And hands up, don't shoot was sort of the big protest chant at the time. And I remember being really angry, and my friend Pat, who worked with me, after the meeting, he was like, "Man, your fists are clenched so tight." And I realized the sort of detriment of this system, not only on the people who get swept into its grasps, but also the people who work inside of the system, who start developing a sort of desensitization to the oppression of other people, thinking that something like this is a joke. And I knew in that moment that I wasn't gonna work, in that environment anymore, and that, that being an artist, pursuing it legitimately was what I needed to do. And so, I took that as a sense of purpose. And so I also say that this was my birth as an artist. That was, that work corrections turned into my undergrad thesis. I had really great professors who inspired me to also become a professor. And so I decided to go to grad school right after I graduated. And I moved to Lincoln, Nebraska. And so, 45 minutes away from Lincoln is Omaha, and Omaha is where I made a majority of this work, at no point in between. Thinking about that idea of sensitivity, again, I had to sort of struggle with that because of the nature of this work. But I think the deeper that I got into it, I sort of thought about my own relationship to anti-Black violence. When I was 14, my mom's boyfriend, Robert, was murdered by our neighbor in a racially motivated fight. And that violence, it's hard enough to lose people. It's hard enough to lose people to violence. But it's almost intolerable to lose somebody to violence that's motivated by a construct that we've made and actively decided to continue believing in. And so I'm going to talk about different forms of violence, sort of inside of the context of this work. Violence done at the level of legislation, violence done at the level of the physical body. But I understand it, and I think that's maybe one of the primary motivations in deciding to make this work. This image is from the spectacle lynching of Will Brown, a black man who was murdered in 1919 in Omaha, Nebraska. Days prior to this image being made, Will Brown was accused of raping a white woman named Agnes Lobeck. And he was arrested, taken to the courthouse downtown in Omaha, and as he awaited trial, a mob gathered and they demanded Brown's release. They rioted, they set the courthouse on fire, and they did these things until the sheriff's department was like, all right, take him, and they let him go. The mob lynched him from a light pole, they shot him, and they dragged his body down through the streets of downtown Omaha. And at an intersection, they set it on fire, and this photograph was made. In 1969, Vivian Strong was with a group of friends listening to music and dancing in a vacant apartment. Someone called the police, and when they got there, everybody, made a run for the door. As Vivian was running away, this officer, James Loader, shot her in the back of the head. 14 years after my mom's boyfriend was murdered, I was in grad school, sitting on my couch and watching this video. This is the police murder of Laquan McDonald. He was caught breaking into cars, and the police chased him, and they shot him 16 times. They said that he lunged at officers with a knife, and this video and eyewitness account completely contradicted that story. At the trial 3 years after his death, his uncle would describe Laquan's murder as death by 1,000 cuts. The first time I visited North Omaha, I was really enthralled with it as a place because it was like the first time since I had been living in Nebraska that I felt comfortable. And that comfort was because I was in an area where everybody else looked like me, where I was, sort of acknowledged in ways of acceptance rather than suspicion. And it was not a difficult experience, but it was really difficult to rectify, like feeling welcome in a place, but then trying to understand the state that it was in. Condemned homes, vacant lots, just a place that looked, disregarded. And so, it's with all of that, all of that sort of prefaced the work. And, I started visiting the neighborhood and taking pictures, trying to figure out, that question of, why does this neighborhood look that way? And of course, on a surface value, we can say, well, yeah, it's like where all the black people are. But to me, it was like there were these reasons that I knew, but I didn't know. I didn't have the language for them. I didn't know how to talk about it. And so, I guess I just sort of went on this endeavor of trying to figure out how photographs of a landscape can, sort of reinterpret really complex narratives of race and power and violence in America. These systems that have been designed to continually target black people, to keep them oppressed and keep them subjugated. And then trying to figure out how that violence, how that structural violence is perpetrated. So, this is like sort of where it starts. This is you can see the exit sign for Lake Street, and that's the main corridor in North Omaha. And I just started showing up and photographing just consistently, just trying to really, just get a sense of this place and again, try to answer those questions that I was after. And the more I started asking around about North Omaha, the more I started to hear about Will Brown and Vivian Strong. And I was really interested in the fact that these stories of like this really extreme violence were kind of the common ways of talking about this particular section of a city. That sort of, I guess that what that led me to was starting to really understand the language of, like what things are sort of implied through language. So in 1919, a race riot was commonly understood as a group of white people going into a non-white neighborhood or area and causing violence. In 1969, after the officer who killed Vivian Strong was acquitted, there were large-scale riots in North Omaha. But there was also a flip in how we understood the term race riot. It was understood as oppressed people exercising their frustrations through acts of violence, because that's like literally the last measure that they have to express their unrest. And understanding these histories, understanding their profoundness on Omaha and its citizens, that's like what led me to seeing, like these visual gaps that I was witnessing in the landscape, like why things were destroyed, why things were run down. It was because of the riots, or so I, thought at the time. And so I kept photographing, and I kept researching, and I eventually came across the concept of redlining. So this is what's called a residential security map, and then there's a key next to it. As you can see, there's different colors. It's coded by color and it's coded by letter. And redlining, if you're not familiar with the process, is a form of government-endorsed segregation, but it does it in this subtle way through the denial of service based on specific parameters. So on this map, you see an A, B, C, and D, and that is telling you the grade of the land or the value of the land. A having the most value, D having the least value. And the pink area in the middle with the D, that's North Omaha. At the time that this map was made, between 1937 and 1939, it's sort of the area sort of bled out. But in the 30s, the federal government sent assessors to major metropolitan areas to figure out the value of land. And one of the ways that they did that was through the racial makeup of populations of specific areas. So again, this pink area is North Omaha, has a D rating because it's a majority black neighborhood. And so, I get this sort of visual evidence of, what I'm seeing, in real time. And this helped me understand that there was more out there. There was more things that I could find. And so I kept digging. And then I found this. This is the underwriting manual, which was published by the Federal Housing Administration and was used by the Homeowners Loan Corporation assessors. And it's very explicit in how assessors could use racial makeup as a way to segregate. And so this excerpt, a part of this reads, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in values. So this is a very clear form of institutionalized racism at its base. Somebody sitting down, typing these words out, deciding, giving people power to go out and say, this is a black area, has lesser value, because black people have lesser value. So you don't want to move there, you don't want to invest there. But then also people who live in those areas, they can't access the funding that banks have because those areas are deemed a poor financial risk, because black people don't have value in the United States of America. Kept digging. This is documentation of the Burwood Wall in Detroit, Michigan, also known as 8 Mile Wall. And it was built to satisfy Federal Housing Authority to guarantee that this new development on the left side would have a clear separation from the black neighborhood that exists on the right side. The federal government said, we will not give you money for your white neighborhood unless you build a wall to keep the blacks out. And so this company did that. They built this wall. That wall's still standing today. And so these things that, again, these phenomena in the landscape, these things we've built up, things that we've torn down, they tell us about our culture. They reflect our values as a culture. And so, I'm making this work and thinking about, I can't have been the only person to be doing this or looking at this. And I came across LaToya Ruby Frazier's work, The Notion of Family. And in that work, she's looking at the erosion of a community because of post-industrialization. So how the steel industry, sort of propped this place up. But once it left, the neighborhood started to fall apart. And then also, just the sort of physical conditions of that work. And then it's like sort of long-term health effects on, her family, her loved ones, members of this community. And in that book, there's this essay, and I came across this term, slow violence. It's a term coined by a sociologist, Rob Nixon, and he, talks about slow violence as a violence that, we perceive violence in, this dichotomous way. He talks about how we perceive violence in two ways. We perceive it as fast violence, or we perceive it as slow violence. And so fast violence is violence that we all sort of understand, like, immediate risk, harm to your body, that type of violence. But there's this other type of violence that is really hard to understand because there are delayed, the effects are really delayed from the cause. So if we're thinking about, Vivian Strong, being murdered in the 60s, right? The community, doing this property destruction, damage. I know that, the gaps that I'm seeing in present day, these vacant lots and things, I know that those histories are connected. But what I wasn't seeing was that back in 1937, someone decided to create an invisible boundary that led to, all of these different causes, right? So in the 60s, the riots happen. You can still see evidence of the property destruction because the community didn't have the means to rebuild itself because nobody's investing in it, and the people who live there can't get access to money. And so with that new understanding, I continued to make the work, and I tried to find ways of teasing that out, like trying to talk about those nuances through things like architecture, topography, and infrastructure. And so like I said, I was living in Lincoln at the time that I made this work, and I would commute 45 minutes to get to the neighborhood. And I was taking the freeway, an essential piece of infrastructure that is common in sort of the narratives of how a red line, sort of the trajectory of a red line neighborhood. The freeway always seems to make an appearance in that. So groundbreaking for the North Freeway happened in the 1960s. And it was built through North Omaha as a way to accommodate the city's growing population, and also, for people to have quicker access to the airport and the more northern points of the town, suburbs, and things. This freeway was initially planned to be routed through a white neighborhood, but they eventually rerouted it through North Omaha because, people who lived in those white neighborhoods just wouldn't allow that. They said, no, you can't do it. And the city listened, and they put it through the black neighborhood instead. Families were compensated for right-of-way, but this splintered the community, and the neighborhood suffered a 30% housing loss. And so, when I was making this work, I was trying to figure out how can I be inclusive of the freeway, but then also how can I try to dismantle it as a structure, metaphorically through images. And then, I started wondering, well, what else can imagery do? Not just the photographs that I was making, but imagery generally. And so I started digging through archives as a way to better understand how my own photographs could, sort of react or respond to images that I was finding. And I think I was so immersed in the specificity of North Omaha. I had these blinders on, but in the periphery, there's all this rich material that was out there. This is an aerial photograph of a freeway being built through a black neighborhood in San Antonio, Texas in 1969. And, I tried to find, I was looking specifically for an image like this from the documentation of the North Freeway. And the only things that I could find were documentation done on the ground. And so, I found this image and I was like, oh man, that would be really great if this was in North Omaha. And then I, sat with it for a while, and I'm like, wait a second, like, that's the same story. It's the same thing. It just happens to be in a different location. So why shouldn't I include it? And that's when I started bringing appropriation into the work, in this hyper direct way. That San Antonio could tell the story of North Omaha, could tell the story of LA, could tell the story of Detroit, could tell the story of Minneapolis, so on and so forth, right? Like go out and look at the history of redlining in metropolitan areas surrounding you where you might be from. And there's probably, again, a freeway, the construction of a freeway involved to bypass it. So that, sort of opened up these doors for me, feeling emboldened to be more inclusive of these archival images that I was finding. And so I wanted to include, images of Will Brown and Vivian Strong. And this was, one of the few portraits that I could find of Will Brown, and it was like a scan from microfiche film from a newspaper. And it's a really beautiful portrait, but I wasn't satisfied with the quality of it. And so, and I was also thinking about what it meant to include him in this work, sort of as this sort of honorific, but maybe trying to do it outside of this way, this way where maybe he can be thought of as something other than a victim. And so I made a digital negative, from that image. I printed it as on transparency film, and made a contact sheet from that in the darkroom. And then I scanned it back in digitally and did some more work on it. And I came up with, these paired images of Will Brown and Vivian Strong. And after I did that, after I saw the result, it felt like it had an emotional resonance to it, that it was speaking in a way, sort of the softness and how, he kind of glows. And I wanted to start doing that, trying to tease out feeling from images through manipulating them, whether that's in really kind of drastic ways or maybe in more direct ways, like simply cropping some information out. How can we reflect upon this violence? That lynching photograph of Will Brown, it's a really hard image to look at. But there's a lot of crucial information that exists in it, but we have to train our eyes. We have to pay attention to see it. When we look at that image, it's really easy to get sucked into, the violence and the atrocity. But behind Will Brown's body is a group of white men. The only people in this image are a group of white men, standing and smiling for the camera, putting their barbarism on display. You see that some of them have particular ties and hats. Those are members of various social clubs in town who are trying to represent their organizations front and center. 2 men from this image were tried and both acquitted. So even though they have solidified their complicity in this act, this image did not serve as evidence to put them away for the murder that they committed. That tells us a lot about the culture, the society that we exist in, who matters most and who doesn't matter at all. I wanted this work to maybe bend time in that way, that you can understand past and present simultaneously inside of an image. That artwork can have meaning past solely being beautiful. That it has the ability to create context in really complicated ways. That we can grapple with this idea of sight and belief through looking at a flat surface. And that it's important to consider these images because this isn't the last time that we're going to see such images. The first time that I watched a video like this, that I watched this video in particular, I felt this fear that I hadn't really felt before. And I thought about my mom because I learned fear through her. But the fundamental difference between these two types of fear is that the fear that I was learning from my mom was a fear that was rooted in love. That I needed to understand what it felt like to be scared, so I knew, like, I could recognize danger. And so that love is where the portraits come in. And it was the last part of the project that I worked on, and it was something I felt really reluctant to do. Again, thinking about the ethics of including images of people, who, are from the neighborhood, who have ties to the neighborhood, who were living in the neighborhood at the time I was making images. But I didn't want to do that up front because I didn't understand, the history of the community, the history that they had, that people that live there have to reckon with, the history and contemporary realities that they have to reckon with. And it took a lot of time to work up to that, but I'm glad that I took that time. My friend Lisa wrote an essay for this work, and I'm just going to read that to close out the lecture today. At moments, I tell you, these photographs crush me. The golden hush settling across the street, how when she turns her face to the light, she glows. Your sampling of history and the way silence speaks between. I want to call what I see beauty, but what I think I mean is love. Because it is a kind of love when a people who know observation can imperil say, I will let you look at me. And when you stand behind the camera and say, I see you. A love in seeing in someone else's eyes that red lines were one of the many lies told to fix the image. And that black people have always written around them and through them and all over the top. In the beginning, you and I were born into this place. Ours is a country that would force you to see your outlines in the body of a boy shot to death on Chicago's Southwest Side, and absolved me from recognizing mine in the lyncher's smile. That blindness means that I struggle to find language to tell the story while you speak it in registers. I won't lie to you. There's a part of me when I look at the woman with dark skin and pink lips and arms thick like mine that wants to ask her for a forgiveness she does not owe me. Give me a chorus to repeat so I don't have to articulate my own reckoning. She looks back at me, but remains silent. In the end, the defense tried its best to use the mother's words against her son. She refused to speak. When I go looking, the photograph I find is of the boy smiling shy beneath a red mortarboard, a long hand not yet grown into holding a rolled diploma. I envision the family, wrung out from knowing that too many strangers watched their boy take his last breath, sifting through the snapshots to find the one that delivers his memory. Behold, this you can have of him. The rest we will keep. After I made this work, I spent a little over a year working with an independent publisher. His name is Sean Bush. He runs Deus Books. And he really wanted to publish this project. And I was on board with it, but I told him that we had to be really sensitive to what the work meant. I felt that maybe the best way of doing that was trying to use, this like product design to speak to, different levels of experience, that went into this work and sort of the things it tries to address. And it was a really wonderful process. He's a phenomenal artist and designer. And, I remember early on, he asked me what I thought the book looked like before, we even started talking about like putting work in it or anything. And I told him that I wanted it to look heavy. I wanted it to give off like a weight, like if you picked it up like that, you might feel some resistance. And I told him that, I wanted it to be like a completely black object. And so this is, the front cover of the book. It's this black faux leather. The foredge of the book is painted black. And then there's a blind emboss on the cover and on both the front and back cover. And so you see like these little markings, and that's actually documentation from the autopsy report from Laquan McDonald, with just like the figure of the body sort of removed. And so on the front, it's the documentation of all of the entrance wounds of those 16 shots. And then on the back, it's all of the exit wounds. So it's, like a book that really, like in different ways, kind of calls the viewer to attention. And so this is a video that Sean made. You can find this online if you want to take some time to look at it. The book is, sold out. There were only 175 copies made. You can usually get it through interlibrary loan, so definitely use interlibrary loan. If you don't know what that is, talk to a librarian. They're phenomenal people. But yeah, as you saw, there was like a small image that isn't bound into the book. Printed images, and then just like there's like an insert that we put into it. And the really special part about this book is that it's completely handmade by Sean. All 175 copies passed through his hands. Like he constructed all the books. The printing was the only thing that we did, sort of out of house, so to speak. But it, I had published a book before. That was an okay experience. I think I, compromised a lot, with that publication. But working, with Sean on this project, it really sold me again on publishing my photography work, because he just provided a lot of space, to let the ideas of the work and then the ideas that I had, sort of lead. And even though, it made the book more expensive to produce, which ultimately meant that we could only make so many copies of it, he was willing to go there. And I think about that sort of freedom as an artist, collaborating with other people, and how important, it is to have when working with others. And then in the gallery, you'll see this piece titled "Return 2892 Maple Street." So, it's like this kind of dual video piece, two videos on separate screens. And the left, I made those in 2017-ish, I think, of this abandoned house. So they're just these really still, kind of long shots just looking at this house. And then I went back to Omaha for the first time in a really long time last summer. And I went to the spot where this house was because when I had photographed it, that notice on the door is just basically telling whoever owns the property that it's going to be torn down. So I knew, like, whenever I went back, that I would sort of make this companion video of the empty lot, as it sits now. And I think that, like, I've always, like, when I give lectures like this, a typical question is like when do you know as an artist, like, a work ends? And I've never really been able to answer that question. It's like, well, it can go on forever if you let it. So I guess you just got to decide at some point. But like this, I think, is like the first time where, like, making a work of art, like, truly felt like a sort of ending of sorts. That, like, I could, sort of do this and then kind of close the door on this work. Not necessarily like on showing it and things, but just, just like that. I didn't really have to, like, I didn't have to think about it anymore, that it could just exist as it is. And, that's all it'll ever be. But yeah, thank you for coming out tonight. I appreciate your time and your attention. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Yes.
What do you think will happen at the Museum of Modern Art, given the people who are likely to come there to see your work?
The lecture that I'll be giving there? Yeah, I think that'll be an interesting lecture. I don't think I'll talk about this work specifically. It's a selection of artists who are sort of responding to the Wolfgang Tillmans exhibition that's up right now. And that's what, like, the programming is for. But I'm bringing some of the same ideas from this work into that discussion. The topic is are new images possible? And so I feel like the way that what I want to talk about is, I don't really have a term for it. Maybe like metaphysical images, race itself as an image. Even though it's like, it's something that, of course, can be sort of documented with, like, a photograph, right? But it's something that exists, it's an image that exists in our minds. And I think because of that, like, new images are always going to be possible. But I want to, what I feel like I want to contribute to the discussion is, are new images of race possible? I don't know where the conversation will go, but I guess we'll see. Yeah. Yes?
Hey, so I was wondering if you could maybe speak to the dynamic going from corrections to this newer work and your role in producing portraits in both, and that kind of power dynamic, and your role during corrections versus here, where we see you kind of continued a lot of the making the figures anonymous in some ways, or they represent themselves as being anonymous, and just maybe talking about that role and maybe the intimacy of portraiture in those two different.
Yeah. I think in corrections, intimacy played a large role in the sense that to be able to, like, work with the kids as a tracker, trust was a fundamental thing. Like, I would be intervening in very, like, high stress, high emotion situations, and it was my responsibility to, like, just bring the temperature down in the room, right? Early in that job, I learned that, like, if these kids don't trust me, this isn't gonna work. Like, I'm just gonna walk in, and then they're just gonna, like, it's gonna set things off, even more. So, I had to gain their trust because of that. I think a part of that is developing a relationship with somebody. And then, like, had I not developed those relationships, I don't think that I would have been able to make the work, because the kids wouldn't have wanted to do that. So like I think there's like that sort of side of it. And then the other side is like, you know, trying to find ways of navigating, you know, my role as, you know, a student and an artist, and a role as like a professional. And, you know, so I think that was like more like tangible things. Like I would arrange to, like, you know, I would arrange to meet with them outside of my working hours, you know, to talk with both them and their parents about, you know, like, is this okay? You know, if they had questions about like why I was asking to make pictures, and trying to like, you know, explain that as best as I could at the time, right? And then, you know, like showing up to make the image, always leading with like, you know, asking them how they felt they wanted to be seen, you know, whether that's like, you know, thinking about their dress, thinking about the location, thinking about the posing, like all of those things I would try to like bring up and, you know, get them to talk. And like most of the time it was just like, man, you're the photographer, you figure it out, you know? I liked working with them in the sense that it was like hard yes, hard no, right? There wasn't like any sort of like in between. They were like either down to ride or they weren't. But yeah, I feel like having that relationship. And then even like something I noticed was that, you know, when I told them that, oh, I'm like in school and I'm studying photography and I want to be an artist, you know, I'm sharing things about my personal life that like we weren't really encouraged to like ever share, or just like share it very minimally, or like maybe sort of in these ways where there's these very like clear sort of barriers or boundaries, to like kind of shut them down and not ask too many more questions, you know what I mean? But once I started to open up about those things, I think it just made our relationships that much deeper, because it was like humanizing me in a way, right?
Yeah, also made it more collaborative too, and let them to present themselves.
Yeah. And then, you know, like with this work, you know, there's like a few people in the portraits that I like, you know, knew a little bit, you know, either through school or, you know, just like kind of being, you know, around. And then, but a lot of them, a majority of them are just chance encounters with people as I'm out making pictures. But, you know, like how I was talking about, you know, sort of my feelings towards the neighborhood, that I felt welcome and that I felt safe, was that I was out there, you know, in the early days, it was, you know, I had a view camera, like a, you know, monorail camera. And so I'm like lugging this thing and I'm, you know, putting the dark cloth over my head, and like, you don't see that. It's not common, right? Like, it's not like something you're just driving to work and you just see someone like whatever. And so like a lot of people would stop and be like, what are you doing? Or they thought I was like, you know, working for the city. Like one time I was making a picture and this dude pulls up and he's like, you with the city? And I was like, huh? And he's like, when are they gonna clean this shit up? And I was like, I don't know, man, you know, I'm not from the city. But I think it was, you know, everyone who approached me, it was always just like a genuine curiosity of, you know, like, yeah, what I was doing. And, you know, like, then we get into conversations about the history of the neighborhood, and I would learn a little bit about them. And then, you know, I think, and that was like a big part of it too, was like not forefronting the portraits, because I did some earlier portraits and they just weren't good, but my approach was all wrong. And I was sort of working from this attitude that you sort of get spoon-fed as a student of photography, that like this camera gives you a right to just go out and do stuff, right? And so, you know, once I stopped doing that and I would just be talking with people, you know, I would like, you know, be in conversation with somebody, but then I would like maybe notice like a gesture that they made, or, you know, whatever. And then we would wrap up our conversation and I would be like, man, I could make a really good portrait right now, but I'm just not going to. I'm not ready yet. And then, you know, like once I felt ready to do that, I learned from just being patient and waiting it out that I let the conversation lead. And then, you know, I let the camera imply that I might ask, right? And then, you know, like if I, you know, felt like, you know, I wanted to ask, then I would. And then it's just like, yeah, like a sort of negotiation from there. You know, just trying to, again, explain what I'm doing, explain what I'm talking about. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Todd.
Can you share a little bit about how you've also used other non-photographic objects in your project? I mean, you don't have
Yeah.
images of them, which is
Yeah.
hard to talk about something.
Oh, sure.
But
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was something that started in corrections. I started taking, items that the kids would come into contact with from being incarcerated. So things like jumpsuits and, the ankle monitors that they would sometimes have to wear. And, all these things that they would come into contact with. And I started photographing them on, like these white backdrops. And so it's just, all you're seeing is the object. At the time, I probably just thought it was like, oh, this is slick, right? I wasn't really thinking about it. But the more research that I started doing, thinking about like the history of the mugshot, where that comes from, we're talking, these daguerreotypes of enslaved people made by this photographer, J.T. Zeeley, commissioned by this, I can't remember his name, Louis Agassiz, who was like one of these images of enslaved people made to basically say that through the study of physiognomy, just contributed to eugenics, right? Like black people are lesser, look at these physical features, look at their big foreheads and blah, 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 whatever they were saying. But using that as a way to justify enslavement. So how they made those images where they, had, these enslaved people stand in front of the camera, taking off their clothes, front, back, side profiles, right? Alphonse Bertillon's like, yeah, that works. Let me introduce this into criminology, and let's start building criminal types with the same junk science, right? So, you get into that's how photography gets sort of incorporated into the criminal justice system. So, these objects that I was photographing on these sterile backgrounds, it was in, I guess, this odd sort of way, treating the system, so to speak, in the way that it's treating people, stripping something of its context to look at its sort of physical quality. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
I was just wondering, what significance that specific house on Maple Street has to you, and why you chose to photograph and document that one specifically?
Yeah. I mean, I saw it one day when I was driving, and something about the chimney. The chimney was the house was obviously in complete disrepair. The chimney was the only thing about the house that was could probably still maybe serve its purpose. And I guess maybe I thought of that as some sort of a beacon, but whenever I felt sort of lost when I was out in the neighborhood and didn't really know what to photograph, I would just sort of go back to this house and maybe sit and just kind of think for a little bit. But then I started working with this art center that's in North Omaha called the Union for Contemporary Art. And one of the education directors, Jade Rogers, that was her grandparents' home. They lost the home because when the freeway was built, Jade's family's house was destroyed. They moved to South Omaha, and then a lot of the other family members moved. The grandparents were the only ones who stayed. Everyone just kind of went off and lived their lives. Grandparents died, they lost the house. And so it was, I don't know, I'm not a very spiritual person, but something about that, just this coincidence that I'm sort of recognizing this thing as a beacon, and then I actually end up meeting a descendant of that house, and I'm trying to think actively about its history, and here in present day I find a person who can tell me deeply about it, so I think that's definitely the significance of it. Yeah. Any other questions?
Okay, well, like I mentioned, there'll be a reception for his exhibition up in the gallery. Hope to see you all there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zora.